Howdy, Bible study leaders. My name's Trey Corey. I'm one of the pastors here at Grace, and I had the opportunity at our Southwood campus to have taught through this passage in James chapter 2, the first half of the chapter, verses 1 to 13. And so that's where we're going to be walking through your lesson and the Bible study through it. I think it's an incredibly fun passage, an incredibly challenging passage. We're going to talk a little bit about partiality and favoritism, and really kind of when our preferences cannot be our prerogative when it comes to how we treat people. So often we have preferences about all kinds of things, and we even can have preferences about people. And so what James is going to do in James chapter 2 is going to really address the issue that when you and I have preferences about people, it really is not just problematic, but James is going to move to the idea that it's actually evil. And so in James chapter 2, he's going to kind of hit this idea with us, helping us think through, why do we extend honor to some people and we withhold that honor or even that attention from other people? In James 2, that's going to be the focus, but the question is, why is that his focus? Why does he even go here? Many will argue and many will wrestle throughout the book of James as to how does one passage fit with another. And so one of the things I think that's most helpful to do week after week, but particularly this week, is wrestling with how does this passage fit with the previous week? Many will kind of rightfully recognize that James doesn't write like Paul. Paul is almost like a lawyer who's so ordered in his progression from one idea to the next, from one passage to the next, that it's easy to trace his flow of thought often. But with James, it's a little bit more difficult. And so, which is why I would submit to you guys as leaders kind of walking through your groups, it's really, I think, worth your time, worth the effort, not just in your own personal study, but in the group to really kind of help the group continue to track the flow of thought for James. As we began with trials and temptations at the beginning of chapter 1, as we ended in the end of chapter 1, looking at kind of being doers of the word. But then lastly, the very last verse in chapter 1, I think really sets the stage for why James goes into the topic that he goes into here in chapter 2. If you remember that in James chapter 1, verse 27, James kind of ended on this finale as he wrapped up chapter 1. He said this, that pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress. He gives us kind of closing charge at the end of chapter 1, in which he says kind of one of the key hallmarks, one of the key healthy markers of a believer who's walking with Jesus Christ is that there's going to be a willingness and a passionate engagement on a consistent basis with widows and orphans. Now, as we joked around and we might have said last week, maybe many of us don't necessarily know a lot of widows and orphans. And so I think widows and orphans are a bit illustrious or an example of those that are just more generally needy and vulnerable. So what James is saying as he wraps up chapter 1 is that for those that are walking with Jesus Christ, that have a vibrant, healthy relationship, there's going to be in them a characteristic, a quality that we're going to see, a pattern that we're going to see in their lives, and that they're willing to, and they're consistently engaged with the needy and the vulnerable around them. And so then he gets into chapter 2, and I think what he's going to do in chapter 2 is he's going to surface a problem that he sees in our hearts, that if it's not checked, if it's not dealt with, then we're going to have a problem fulfilling what he just told us was a key piece of our walk with Jesus Christ. That there's an issue in our hearts and our lives, is this issue that we're going to refer to as favoritism or partiality, that if that issue isn't addressed, then we're going to have a very difficult time taking care of those that are needy and vulnerable. And what he's going to do in chapter 2 is he kind of walk through the example of the rich and the poor. We're going to talk through that here in just a second. He's going to show us that we have a tendency to extend honor to those that can benefit us, and we have a tendency to withdraw or neglect those that can't benefit us. And if that's true, then when it comes to the needy and the vulnerable, we're going to have a tendency to disregard them and dismiss them because they can't pay us back with the kindness and the mercy that we may extend to them. And so really what James is going to do for this first half of chapter 2 is go right at that core issue. Our tendency in favoritism or partiality to extend honor to those that can benefit us and withhold that honor from those that can't benefit us. Because if that's not checked, if that's not dealt with, then we are not going to be able to fulfill what he just said at the end of chapter 1, which is that we're called to care for the widows and the orphans that are around us, or the needy and the vulnerable that are around us. And so really, I think for you guys, as you jump into this passage this week, it's going to be really important that you can tie chapter 2, verse 1, all the way back to chapter 1, verse 27, and that linkage of that command to care for widows and orphans, because it sets the stage and sets the context for why he's got to address this issue that exists in our life, because it creates a linkage there. And so I'd say week to week is a great opportunity to, as you begin your group, you can begin your study, even before you necessarily get into observations, but one of those observational kind of experiences you can give your group is to kind of begin to think through again each week, how does this passage fit with the previous passage? It's a little easier with Pauline, it's a little harder with James, but it's really worth the time, worth the effort. And I think especially important as you look at this passage as it relates to the previous passage. Then as you kind of get to the flow of thought, I love the questions that are here in our packet related to the observational questions, particularly the one related to contrast. And so I'd really much encourage you to give your group time thinking through the passage as a whole, having read through it, thinking through what are the different contrasts that exist here. I think it's a great way to warm up everyone's minds. It's a great opportunity to also have a question that's easy to answer, to not feel too intimidating, to just find the contrasts that are there. A few of the ones that stand out are obviously the idea of rich and poor. Rich and poor is going to be a dominant one through this passage. Also, it's kind of easy to see the idea of judgment and mercy. A few of the others that are here that I think are really, really interesting is I find it fascinating the contrast that gets created in verse 3, in which they imagine the rich and the poor walking into the church, and the rich are told to go sit over here, and the poor is told to go sit over there. That even the contrast between here and there, I think is significant. Not only that, but I think you get a contrast throughout this passage of the idea of love versus favoritism and partiality. That James is going to say it multiple different ways, that favoritism is a way that we dishonor people, that love is a way that we honor people. So I think you see honor and shame. I think you're going to see love versus partiality, or love versus favoritism. That kind of contrasting exercise to find those contrasts, I think really help kind of get people into the passage, to get their sleeves rolled up, and to really let them engage, whether they feel really confident in a Bible study context or whether they feel a little bit intimidated. That's an easy question that everyone can kind of play with. And so make sure you kind of get people, I think, engaged there to begin with. In terms of interpretive questions for this study, really that kind of background exercise, thinking through the rich and the poor, is really helpful. Like a lot of cultures, in this culture, you had a real divide between the rich and the poor. And in early Christianity, you had a lot of people coming to the faith that were more from the poor. So when someone that was rich walked in, they very much would have easily noticed. And they very much would have thought, can this person help us as a church? And can they help me even in my own personal standing and personal situation? And so really, as James begins to think about how we care for the vulnerable and the needy, he's going to kind of go to the idea of the rich and the poor, because it's an easy example to think through how the church might have responded to some that they could have viewed financially with means that could have helped them, and how they could have disregarded those that had no financial means that could have helped them. And so this rich and poor provides an easy example to anticipate what would have happened and probably what was happening within their assembly or within their meetings. And so what James says as he goes on here looking at this example, and I love the way he goes through this example, thinking through how they respond to the rich and the poor in verses 2, 3, and 4. But then eventually what he does here as he kind of wraps up verse 4, as he says at the end, he says, "Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives?" Really, again, the issue with favoritism is not necessarily just making distinctions. We make distinctions all the time. But it's particularly here that they were treating people with distinctions with and for evil motives. That they were only granting honor to some that could help them, and they were withholding it from those that couldn't help them. That they were making distinctions with motives that were evil in nature. And particularly why I think it's evil, particularly why I think it's such a big deal here, is that if you think about honor and shame, so much of the question here in chapter 2 comes to, well, why do we have worth at all? Why are we worthy of attention? Why are we worthy of worship? Why are we worthy of being dignified and having value at all? And I think part of what we see here in James 2 is that culturally speaking, they would often place value or give dignity and worth to people based off of a series of external circumstances, whether that's riches, finances, whether that's accomplishments, whether that's social standing. And what James is trying to do is appeal to a definition of worth and value that's not circumstantial and that's not external. Particularly walking through our scriptures, what we see from Genesis all the way through Revelation is that all the way going back to Genesis chapter 1, that God creates humanity in his image. That if we think about why humanity is worthy and why all of humanity has dignity and worth, it's because we've been created in the image of God, irrespective of race, irrespective of age, irrespective of background, culture, or experience, or accomplishment. That every single one of us has been created with the capacity to have a relationship with the Creator God, to represent him in his created world, and to even rule on his behalf. And so every single one of us has been endowed with dignity because we are in his image. And what we see from the scriptures as the scriptures unfold is that as sin enters the picture in Genesis 3, that dignity is defaced, but it's not erased. That glory and that dignity, in a sense, is covered over, but it's not removed entirely. And so what God begins to do throughout the redemptive plan of God throughout our Bibles is that we see that he's working to bring about not just a restoration of our relationship with him if we trust his son, Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection, but he's also working and moving to bring about a restoration so that we can be restored not just to relationship, but to the glory and the dignity that he initially endowed us with. And so what James is trying to do is trying to say that every single one of us is worthy of value and respect and dignity. And so to have partiality in which we give and recognize that value for some, but we don't recognize it for others is so problematic because it not only confuses the gospel in which Jesus has died for every single one of us because every single one of us is worthy of his death, worthy of his great sacrifice so that we could be restored to a relationship with him. But every single one of us also has the opportunity to represent him and be restored to that glory. And so to have favoritism and that we extend glory to some, but not others becomes so problematic because it goes so contrary to the gospel, so contrary to the work of God. In fact, as you kind of get into question 2, looking at verses 7 or verses 5 and on, what we see is that it's not just contrary to the gospel, but it's also contrary to the very choice, the direction, the trajectory of God and how God works. What James is trying to say in chapter 2, verse 5 is that God chose the poor. And so why would we neglect the poor and choosing the rich when God went in the opposite direction, having chosen the poor to make them rich, to allow them to be inheritors of the kingdom that's to come? He doubles down on that exhortation when he says, in fact, it's the rich that drag you to court. So why would you choose the rich that are dragging you to court and that are also blaspheming the name of the Lord when it's the poor that God chose? And then it's the rich that are blaspheming his name. Why would you choose the rich? The rich just get richer. Chapter 2, verses 5 to 7 kind of give us 3 rhetorical questions that keep driving the point home that favoritism moves us contrary to the choice of God, and it confuses the gospel itself. It confuses the work of God and how God moves and how God works. I like question 3, in which James introduces the royal law, and you get this repetition of law throughout chapter 1 and chapter 2. And so many will ask, what is the law of liberty? What is the royal law? And what we see kind of over and over throughout chapter 1 and throughout our section here in chapter 2 is that the law of liberty or the law of freedom or the law of Christ or the royal law seem to be synonymous throughout these verses with kind of the same idea. It's the law of Christ. It's the will of God written on our hearts that the Spirit has given us the ability to obey. And we have the ability and the desire to obey because of the Spirit. And so really, particularly here, though, as we think about favoritism, really that aspect of what is the will of God that we're being called to is this idea that we would love our neighbor as ourselves. That core concept is captured in the Old Testament. It's also captured in the New Testament. And it's going to be the ethic that James is going to call his audience to consider. Because favoritism or partiality, granting honor to some and withholding it from others, is contrary to love. It's contrary to the rule of law. And it's contrary to the idea that we would love our neighbor as ourselves. And really by the end of chapter 2, as we kind of get into these verses 8, 9, and 10, James kind of begins to move us more broadly just from the example of the rich and the poor to the idea of our neighbor more generally. And so I think as you're walking through those verses and so many of the cross-references here in Leviticus, Matthew, Galatians, and eventually Romans are places where we see this repetition of the call that we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so really, as we kind of get into this idea of honor, shame, as we get into the idea of partiality, the exhortation is that we would love our neighbor as ourselves as a way to avoid partiality. Because you cannot live with an attitude of favoritism while also loving any and all neighbors as ourselves. That's what James is going to try to do, to say that because of that, as we kind of get into question 4 in verses 9 to 11, that when we commit and when we live in favoritism, or we live with an attitude of favoritism, or we commit kind of and live with a partiality between peoples, what James is saying is that we're actually breaking that law. Verses 9, 10, and 11 kind of begin to highlight the fact that we become transgressors of the law, that love is put in contrast with partiality, that love is put in contrast with favoritism, that you cannot uphold that law while granting honor to some and withholding it from others. So in verses 9 to 11, he's trying to drive home that this normal human tendency that exists in all of us, even though it's so normal and maybe so ingrained in the way that we think when we walk into a room, the way that we think when we walk into the circle of our friends and we think about our social relationships, that though it's ingrained in the way that we think maybe, and that it's so kind of a default operating manner, that it is sin. And that James is going to try to draw the point that if we continue to operate in that manner, then we'll never care for the needy and the vulnerable, because they're the least likely to ever be able to pay us back. And so we'll always end up disregarding them and dismissing them and unable to fulfill one of the key healthy marks of what a believer who's walking with Jesus and maturing in faith and a relationship with him does and looks like. Verses 9 to 10 and 11 to kind of highlight that. Verse 12 and 13 is going to command us to speak and act as those that are judged by the law of liberty. And really this last part of this passage really surfaces the idea of judgment for the first time. The idea that the believer in Jesus Christ that has a saving relationship with him will actually one day be evaluated by how they have lived. And so we're being called to act in such a way knowing that there is a judgment that is coming for us. In fact, verse 13 is meant to be a bit of a warning when James says, "For judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy, because mercy triumphs over judgment." What is the judgment that James is talking about here in chapter 2? It's going to be the same theme. It's going to be the same question we spend a lot of time talking about next week in the second half of chapter 2, because that thread's going to be seen here clearly, and then that thread's going to be woven all the way through the second half of chapter 2 when we look at one of the most controversial passages of the book, which is going to be a really fun discussion and a fun Bible study for us next week. But really, James really kind of most clearly inserts and introduces that concept here in which the believer who has a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, who's entered into a relationship with him absolutely freely, not on the basis of works, but on the basis of faith, in which our sins have been forgiven because of the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. And our faith in that finished work in which he was died, buried, and resurrected for us allows us to enter into a relationship with him. But even in that relationship, what James is trying to say is that we are called to live in a certain way. And that though that relationship is secure, the security of that relationship does not mean that we won't one day be evaluated in how we lived. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 gives us an example of how that evaluation can go. Either we can have lived our life in a way that what we've invested our life into can last and will receive reward, or we could have lived our lives as believers in a way that there's nothing that lasts from how we've invested our lives. Everything will be wiped away. Nothing will endure into eternity because we invested our life into things that only matter now. James is trying to elevate our view to recognize that how we live now matters as believers in Jesus Christ. Choosing to disobey, choosing to break the law does not mean that we will lose that relationship, because that relationship is secure and unconditional. But it does impact reward. It does impact, in a sense, even what God is going to say, how that judgment will go. And he says very strongly in verse 13, it can be merciless to the one who shown no mercy. But I think he gives us a clue and an encouraging last clause here when he says at the end of 13, the end of our passage, that mercy triumphs over judgment. I think what James is trying to say is that there is a test that's coming one day for the believer as to how we lived. And that test can create a moment of hesitation. It can create a moment of recognition, of evaluating, just, am I living in a way that matters now? Am I living in a way that will last for eternity? But before we kind of move into a place of feeling terrified or discouraged by that, what James does as he wraps up this passage, he says, hey, if you're loving the least of these, if you're loving and if you're extending kindness and mercy to those that can't repay it back, then don't worry, because there's going to be a grading curve on this test for you. For those that love the most needy, for those that care for the vulnerable, that evaluation will be on a grading curve, and we need not worry at all. Because it's a key piece for us as we think about what it looks like to walk with Jesus, that we would care for the needy and the vulnerable. And so I would just tell you, thinking through this passage, it's challenging to interpret, but I would argue it's probably even more challenging to apply. And so I would encourage you, especially as you think about this idea of judgment, introduce it this week. Don't camp out on it or spin away on it, because it's going to be such a key piece for next week. So I think you've done your job, leaders, if you can introduce the idea, make sure there's a preliminary understanding about it, because we're going to spend a lot more time on it next week. Because really what I want to make sure you do in the midst of this passage and this study is that you don't lose time for some meaningful reflection and consideration of how do you apply this. I'll tell you, I think if you begin in chapter 1 or end in chapter 1 looking at the needy and vulnerable, you get into chapter 2 looking at rich and poor. I think you got to consider, how does this passage apply to how we handle and care for the needy and vulnerable? If part of the way that you apply the passage is to not think about those people groups at all, I think you've kind of missed the point. At the same time, I'd say thinking through this passage, it's not just applicable only to how we care for the needy and vulnerable, that it's thinking about how we love and move towards our neighbors in general. And so I would encourage you, as you think through how you apply this, that you spend some time thinking through the needy and vulnerable, and you spend some time thinking more broadly about the principles that are being highlighted here, in which we're thinking of, do I move towards people and extend honor and attention because they can benefit me? And do I possibly at times look at some people and disregard them and dismiss them because they can't benefit me, they can't help me? I love the application questions that we have here, particularly question 1. In your personal life, who have you been tempted to dismiss or look down upon? Are you guilty of favoring any social group or class above another? I think that's a great, specific reflection question to ask. Give your group some time to really think about that collectively and corporately. I think it's so easy sometimes in our passages to really kind of spend so much time on observation and interpretation that we missed a moment for application. And I think this week especially, you don't want to do that. You want to make sure you give them some really meaty time to reflect and to process and to think. I like question 2 here as well. What specific thing will you do this week to demonstrate the royal law of love to someone who you would normally avoid, exclude, or dismiss? Those 2 application questions, I think, are really, really helpful to make application specific. It's easy to kind of get to a principle of, I should honor people that I can't benefit or that can't benefit me, but then what do I do next? And so I think those questions are helping to both create some moments of reflection, but then some real specific steps helping them think through, well, what do we do and what do we do next? Lastly, I'd say to you, I love that one of the last pages here is thinking through the skill of hospitality. At least for me, that's not something as an introvert that is my first go-to. I married an extrovert, so it's always her go-to. And it's something that I've learned and benefited a lot from. But I think it's a great application as you think about kind of the principles of this passage. Thinking through, who have you opened your home up to? Who have you invited to the table to enjoy a meal with? That communal space can be one of the easiest ways to make it accessible and opening a space in your life, in your schedule, for others to come and to convene and to kind of jump in with you. The reason why I really like it is I think it's really easy for us sometimes as we think about caring for the needy and vulnerable to think about it as a service project. What could I do this month and how can I check that box? I love that we're kind of pushing you guys toward the idea of hospitality, because it's not about checking a box. It's not about visiting on a one-time moment, because even the idea of visitation at the end of chapter 1 is the same word that's used for Christ's visitation onto earth. It wasn't a one-time stop, but it was a meaningful investment and even incarnation into our experience. That part of what we're talking about is how do we extend our relationships and how we extend community more broadly so that all kinds of people are a part of our table, all kinds of people are part of our home. At least for my wife and I, that's something that we've been thinking about a lot about this week is it's really easy to begin to think about our lives in a way that they're not that broad and it's not that open to sometimes even see the needs of the community. And so I would encourage you to thinking through how can hospitality be a practice that you develop, that you begin to think through and begin to practice in a more meaningful way this week. Who could you invite over? And who could you invite over that's not already normally in the course of your normal gravity of who you invited and who you walk your life out with? And so I think James chapter 2, great opportunity, challenging passage to think through who we extend honor to naturally, and maybe sometimes who we dismiss and disregard and hold that honor back from. And in that particular group of people, then how do we begin to think about hospitality? How do we begin to think about moving towards those people in a meaningful way to begin to build some relationships and develop some context and some time together with people that we may normally begin to dismiss and disregard? And how do we move in that space in a new way, reordering some of our rhythms and reordering some of our patterns? James chapter 2, I'm going to be praying for you guys as leaders. I love the passage, excited for the conversations you're going to be having, and excited for the ways that it'll stretch us as a church and stretch your groups as well. Thanks for letting me be with you guys, and looking forward to y'all's discussions next week in the latter half of chapter 2.